Okay, I don't know if you knew who was coming in tonight, but you're in for a real treat. In all professions, there's always one that sticks out, no matter what you are. If you're a CPA or if you're a dockhand, there's always one that's considered the best.
Richard is one of the forerunners of change.
This is great. We can all sit in the same club together, white and black, and not understand each other.
He was fearlessly exposing himself to the public. I think you know what I'm talking about.
It's amazing. It can only happen in America.
You knew if you were with Richard, he'd be with 5 other women.
Bags and mounds of cocaine.
We are gathered here today.
I put him there with the great artists, with the Picassos and the Van Goghs.
The two most beautiful words in the world of comedy. Richard Pryor.
Hello, I'm Russell Brand, and over the next hour I'm going to be talking to you about the life of Richard Pryor, who in my opinion is the greatest stand-up comedian who ever lived. My discovery of Richard Pryor, like a lot of people my age, was as an actor. He's the bloke out of Superman 3 to me. But as I grew older and became more interested in comedy and its finest practitioners, I learned about the huge contribution made by Richard. A warmer, more affable Lenny Bruce, a sharper Billy Connolly, a more explicit and cutting Bill Cosby. Richard Pryor comprises the best elements of every stand-up comedian that has ever lived and is the bedrock upon which modern stand-up comedy has been founded. His extraordinary life started in a brothel and came to a tragic end 2 years ago.
We are gathered here today on this sorrowful occasion to say goodbye to the dearly departed. He was dearly and he has departed. Thus, that's why we call him the dearly departed. In other words, the nigga dead.
As you just heard, there will be some disconcerting language in this documentary, and although Richard Pryor later in life did renounce the N-word in his early life, he got right into it. There's going to be some swearing coming up later, so if that sort of thing offends you, please don't listen to this radio show, because I don't want to be a conduit by which you get offended. The major themes that Richard's best known for, like race, sex, drugs and violence, can be traced back to his childhood in Peoria, Illinois, a small town outside of Chicago. Richard was born on December the 1st, 1940, an only child in a large family of unusual circumstances. Richard's daughter, Rain Pryor.
My dad grew up in a brothel, a whorehouse. His mother was a prostitute, his grandmother was a madam, his uncle was a pimp, and, they ran this house of ill repute.
Richard's first son, Richard Jr., remembers his early life in the brothel his father grew up in.
We always had prostitutes around, and we'd sit there and play cards with the prostitutes, and they'd say, "Hold on a minute, baby, I gotta go turn this trick." And they would go up and turn a trick, and then come back down, and you'd finish playing your card game. It's crazy.
Mel Watkins is an author who has written extensively on Richard Pryor.
He said at one point that he climbed up and looked through the door at his mother while she was actually engaged in servicing a client. That kind of casual sexual activity was all around him from his early childhood until he left Peoria.
On top of the tragically undomestic start in life of being raised in a brothel by a prostitute, Pryor also suffered sexual abuse at the hands of a local bully and a priest from a nearby church. Caught up in the chaos and cruelty, a young Pryor was further confused by the oddly mixed messages from those who raised him. Mel Watkins again.
His grandmother was also very religious. She attempted to teach him Christian values, and at the same time he was surrounded by the prostitution. And I think that caused him to have a kind of skewed, oblique view of life, of human nature. And I think that view is one of the things that's most important about comedy.
That can only have been confusing. Well, all this fire and brimstone stuff in church is fantastic, but I couldn't help but notice that when we got home, you accepted money for sex. Don't you worry about that. You just read your prayers. Well, I'm trying to read them. I can keep hearing people have orgasms. So, how did Richard Pryor use his understandably skewed outlook on life to become the comedian's comedian and arguably the greatest stand-up ever?
How do you do it? Well, first you have to be dumb in school. Then when you don't get good grades, you get funny. And it grows, and then you get a job as a comic. And finally get lucky, and you get on television a lot. And you make a couple records, and then one night this happens.
So there you have it. Simply live a life of enforced debauchery and take yourself to the very precipice of insanity, and you too could become a comedic icon. Rain Pryor.
I think, my dad always wanted to get attention. Look, you grow up in a brothel, everyone is screwing somebody else, and you're not getting the attention. He found out that humor was the way. I think that really was his savior in a way, his religion.
I started out in showbiz 1944 in my front yard, and they told me, don't slip in the dog poo-poo. And I did. And I just kept slipping in it and falling, and they just laughed. It was beautiful. And that was my first comedy routine. And I've just been slipping in shit ever since, trying to get laughs.
Small and nervous as a child, Pryor found that comedy gave him respite from the bullying he received from friends and family. His ambition took him beyond slippy dog poo in his nan's backyard, rewarding though it must have been. He finally got his first taste of the stage, aged 11, at the Carver Centre, a youth club in his hometown. A member of staff, a Miss Juliet Whittaker, recognised talent in young Richard, who was too skinny and frail to play basketball, and gave him a part in a production of Rumpelstiltskin. Richard was later given the role of being MC between acts during a talent show at the centre. He started developing his stand-up skills, working real people and situations into his act, a technique that would of course define his work in later life. His childhood friend Pepper remembers.
The characters that he invoked in his comedy actually did live on these streets. A guy that he really admired and liked was a guy named Henry Hansen. He thought he could beat up everybody in the world.
Matt was bad. Ping, ping. Man, Henry Hansen would knock him through a brick wall. Matt backed off. Then I'm standing there all alone. And what you got to do with a little nigga? I come over with Matt, my friend. I wasn't doing anything, man. I was gonna play some basketball. Can I go now?
What's interesting to me is you can see how Richard Pryor's early life and formative experiences were definitive in the artist that he later become. The way that we see that he was able to use circumstance and characters from his life in his later comedy, he was also affected by his hometown, which at the time was definitively segregated. Here's Pepper again.
At that time, we had one restaurant in the downtown area that we could go to. The movie theaters had special places for us. There were no black teachers, not even a black janitor.
I like being a kid very much. I do. I really love it, because then if you was a kid, then you didn't have to be anything else. I was a kid till I was about 8. Then I became Negro. They made me do it in school.
If you was white, she's all right. If you was brown, stick around. But as you black, brother, get back, get back, get back.
At 14 years old, Richard was kicked out of his Catholic school after the school authorities found out what his family were doing for a living. He volunteered in the army in 1958, but was also kicked out of that after a knife fight sparked by a racist remark from another soldier. Returning to Peoria, he briefly settled with his first wife, Patricia, who gave birth to Richard Jr. in 1960. Richard landed a job as a pianist in a local bar, where it was quickly discovered that the jokes he was doing between the cacophonous songs were infinitely preferable than the racket, so his stand-up career started almost incidentally. Richard's old friend, Ernestine, remembers his breakthrough gig.
A guy came from Chicago this one particular night, and we all had played a joke on him, saying that we wasn't going to clap for him. He performed so brilliantly. We all just busted out and started laughing, because he was talking about us, because we wasn't clapping. But it was a big hit with the guy from Chicago.
With promoters starting to take notice, Pryor started out on a tour of the legendary Midwestern route known as the Chitlin Circuit. Many of the greatest black comedians of the era, from Flip Wilson to Red Fox, started off their career as MC between bands in these predominantly black-owned jazz clubs. As Richard honed his performance, he finally shed his MC role and landed a spot on the circuit as a stand-up comic in his own right, with a somewhat distinctive style. Mel Watkins again.
He went from places like Cleveland to Pittsburgh to Youngstown, where I live. I actually saw Richard once. This brash comedian stood up and told the audience that, first of all, they were too loud. They should be listening to him because he was going to be a star. and that 10 years from that day, they would still be getting drunk, and he would be in Hollywood. And he meant it. He walked out after that.
Oh, there's 2 seats. There, that's not taken. Please, sit down. See, you sat in the right seat, because when the show don't be funny, I take my dick out and piss. This is called the garden row.
Richard started scoring big gigs, including supporting some of the most prominent bands on the circuit, like Motown's Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. Singer Martha Reeves remembers.
It must have been 1963 at a place called Leo's Casino in Cleveland, Ohio. And there was this gentleman who opened the show, a young man named Richard Pryor. I thought he was one of the rudest and the most comical people I've ever seen on stage. He went as far as to tell people to get their feet down off the stage and, why is that young kid here? Take him home. It's past his bedtime. He had us rolling on the floor.
Richard started to sense he could be big, and in 1963 moved to New York, determined to emulate the success of the biggest black comedian at the time, Bill Cosby. But to make it like Cosby, it was made clear to Richard that he'd have to change his act. Mel Watkins explains.
One of his managers, I think, said, Bill Cosby's the kind of Negro we can invite to our houses, but, you can't do this other stuff because nobody is going to listen to this. You won't make any money. They basically were telling him to tone down his comedy and do the milder stuff, and he'd be a success on television and so forth. And he came here, and it didn't take him very long. He was immediately successful. He was imitating Cosby, but he was immediately successful.
Richard got a regular spot at the Wah Club in Greenwich Village, supporting folk acts like Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan. Bill Cosby worked in a club across the street, and Richard studied his routines carefully. Here's Bill Cosby.
What he took was, and what he saw was, in me, he saw a success. And then he began to imitate the style of it. Example, I was working on a piece called Noah.
Noah. What? What do you want? You gotta take one of those hippos out and bring in another one. What for? Because you got 2 males down there and you need to bring in a female. I'm not bringing nothing in. Well, I'm sick and tired of this. I've had enough of this stuff. I've been working all day, working on for days and days. I'm sick and tired of this. Noah? Yeah? How long can you tread water?
One time, I came back to New York and I went down to the Y and I stood in the back, and there was Richard on stage doing a piece called Adam and Eve. And oddly enough, there was God talking to them.
Don't mess with the trees, people.
Is he gone? I think so. This is great. What is it? Who cares?
I warned you, young lady.
I'm Russell Brand, and you're listening to Richard Pryor, Was It Something I Said, on BBC Radio 2. By 1967, Richard Pryor's Bill Cosby inspired, by which I mean stolen, material saw him getting high-profile spots on TV shows like Johnny Carson. He moved to Los Angeles, building up a reputation on the prestigious circuit of the largely mafia-run casinos in Vegas. But then, an extraordinary moment of on-stage revelation saw Richard seemingly sabotaging his own career. Here's Mel Watkins.
The story goes that he was on stage and he was doing his Cosby act, and he simply said that reality suddenly intruded into his life and he couldn't deal with it anymore. That all those voices that were underneath started popping into his head and they wanted to get out. And because the people in the audience weren't relating well to that material and wanted the older stuff, he simply said something crude to them and walked off the stage, is what he says. Now, there is also a story that he dropped his pants and mooned them and then ran and jumped naked onto a blackjack table.
I always like to get naked. Did that in Vegas. Got naked, run through the casino nude, right, jumped on the 21 table and said, blackjack.
Lenny Henry.
After he'd had his Road to Damascus moment in Las Vegas, from that moment on, He chose to talk about the ghetto and things that concerned all black people, in fact, all humanity. Poverty, drugs, sex, prostitution, crime. He chose to talk about the seamier side of things.
The worst thing about jail is that your woman come and visit you, man. And they get funky when a nigga's locked up. Right? And she be talking about, I never did like your mama. Who are you talking to? Talking to you, nigga. You the one in jail.
Dramatically shedding his Cosby image in an instant, Richard's comedy style changed radically, becoming more about honest issues like race, sex and drugs, and much, much ruder. I'm gonna have to warn you now that things are about to get a little more explicit, and if you think it might upset you, just maybe push the radio over. Here's Lenny Henry.
He just talks about anything. It's like, Richard, please just edit some stuff. We don't want to hear about the orgy thing. Just edit something. He wouldn't edit anything.
Never take your wife on an orgy. Because they always say things like, you never touched me like that.
Listen, I was doing so much, I embarrassed cocaine dealers.
I used to jack off so much, I knew pussy couldn't be as good as my hand.
Richard's new honesty saw him reach back to mine the hardships of his youth for his routines. Here's Lenny Henry again.
He manages to even discuss the way he was abused in a funny way. Growing up in a whorehouse, he describes it in a way where you just go, my God, this has to be the truth. No one would choose to make this up.
I met some nice white dudes, you know, they used to come down. Hello, little boy. Is your mother home? I'd like a blowjob. I wonder what would happen if niggas go through Beverly Hills doing that.
He talks about his dad beating him. And only somebody who has been beaten really hard by their parents will be able to say something like that. You know, as someone who's lived through some of that stuff, I know what that's like.
I said, man, I'm tired of taking these ass women. I ain't taking no fucking more. And that's it.
Hey, what, you a man now, motherfucker?
Yeah, okay. And he hit me in the chest so hard that my chest just caved in and wrapped around his fist and held it there. I wasn't letting that fist go. I didn't give a fuck what he did. My chest had that fist. Everywhere he moved his arm, I was hanging on. And I didn't know he wasn't gonna kill me. You know, I said, Dad, I'm your son, I'm your son, I'm your son. He said,
no, motherfucker, you was a man a minute ago.
Richard also started to invoke characters in his comedy, bringing the oddballs, weirdos, have-nots and never-will-haves he'd known in his childhood to life in a way that hadn't been seen before in stand-up comedy.
I know you got soul!
Writer Mel Watkins will tell you about that now.
It was totally different than what was going on at that point for a stand-up comedian. It was a performance comedy which was almost theatrical because he would become the characters and he would tell the jokes from their point of view. He would change his voice and he humanized them in a way that brought out the fact that these were not just dummies who were running around drinking a lot of wine, that they also had feelings.
I know you got soul! Hey! If you think you wouldn't be in here!
Lenny Henry.
He could people the stage. The ultimate for any comedian is to be able to perform on your own, but to make it feel like there's, I don't know, 15 people on stage.
Winos don't get drunk like everybody else, though, right? Wino be directing traffic on Sunday morning. Hey, fool, you better slow that car down! Goddamn, don't come driving down through here like you, crazy! This is a neighborhood, this ain't no residential district! Look at that nigga. Look at him in the middle of the street, junkie. Used to be a genius. Get your ass out the street, boy! Move out the way, boy! What's happening? What's happening? I vomited and shit on the floor. I did, man. Didn't make that nigga with that pistol down there clean it up. Nigga talking about, clean up that vomit. I ain't cleaning that shit up. You think you don't clean that shit up? I'll shoot your ass. I said, well, who gonna clean up the blood, nigga?
Pam Adams is a journalist from Peoria who has written extensively on Richard Pryor.
Pryor took the people that we would have tried to hide or deny and made them human also. I like to call him kind of an urban anthropologist because he dug up those stories and told them and left them for posterity.
Pryor's most famous character was Mudbone, a wise old storyteller who he based on an amalgam of drunkards he had known in Peoria.
I had this friend, my partner, his name was Toodlum, see? So the nigga got sick, see? I told him he was messing with this girl from Louisiana. What she did was she put a hex on his ass. That's right, and made that nigga sick. Boy's feet swole up like this, hands shriveled up, blood was coming out his eye. He said, I'll take you over to Jefferson where the voodoo lady live, have her fix it for you. See, because the voodoo lady named Miss Rudolph lived over there, she could do it. We get over there, I'm the one got to knock on the door, see? So I go up to the door, knock on the door. She opened the door, man, the funk rushed out the house, knocked me to my goddamn knees. She said, boy, get your ass in here. Get off the floor. So I walked into the house. I'm kind of nervous because bugs and shit crawling around all on the floor. There's a goddamn bat flying around like this, see? So I explained to her what was happening. I said, my partner's sick. Please, he needs some help. Would you be so kind as to help him? I said, now, first of all, I got to explain to you, I don't have no money. She said, no, I don't want none of that. She said, what you do, though, come Thanksgiving, bring me by a goose or a turkey. That's all right. You know, I said, well, shit, that's fine with me, because it was June then. If I don't never see this bitch no more in life, it's all right with me, see? And just about that time, a big tarantula, this big, crawled up my arm, around my neck. I almost shit on myself, man. Went down this arm, under my hand. I tried to mash him. When I lift my hand up, he was gone. I said, Miss Rudolph, please tell me what happened to the tarantula. She said, that ain't none of your goddamn business. But if you don't bring me that turkey, you will see him again.
Richard's first son, Richard Jr.
Everything that you would hear my dad talk about in his albums about the bums, the wino directing traffic, all came from Peoria. Her with the voodoo dolls. I remember you'd walk down the street and you look at the clothesline and she'd have voodoo dolls hanging on the clothesline. Stuff like that is so crazy you can't make up.
As Richard Pryor's comedy started to delve deeper into the injustices of his past and present, his eyes started opening to other social movements of the late 60s. Separating from his second wife, Shelley, Richard took the advice of his writing partner, Paul Mooney, and in 1969 moved to Berkeley, California, a hotspot for artists, poets and Black Panthers.
Like a sound you hear that lingers in your ear, but you can't forget from sundown to sunset. Nah, nah. California soul. California soul.
Here's Paul Mooney.
I'm the one that convinced him to go to Berkeley and get some education. You know, I went to school with him in Newton. I was born in Louisiana, but I was raised in that atmosphere. And I said, you have to go up there. It's different from New York and LA. And so we drove up.
A racially conscious road trip? I'll be there, said Richard, and promptly hightailed it with Paul to the Berkeley campus where he went through a stylistic metamorphosis. Here's Lenny Henry again.
When he walked away from Vegas, he basically walked away from the white mainstream. So going to California and going underground meant that the black community could reabsorb him, could claim him as their own.
Pryor started to read more and hang out with radical black writers like Ishmael Reed and Cecil Brown. Slowly, he started to shed the coddled atmosphere of LA lunches and guest spots on daytime TV. Here's Bill Cosby.
Being in Berkeley, the Black Panthers, etc., one would pick up on the social, racial, political part of it.
I got ultra black for a while. No, I did. I got down into it. I'd go to meetings shit, and brothers be rapping. I never knew what they were saying, though. But the brothers be having emotion. You see, the first thing you got to know is about eating pork. Now, you eat a piece of pork, you don't realize the certifications of this individuality's prospect. What the man trying to lay on you through porkitis, you will not understand because the trichinosis of your mind would not relinquish the thought of individuality. You know what I mean?
Richard's comedy output started to become heavily influenced by the black liberation movements and started including radical commentary on racism in America. His subsequent records, such as the provocative That Nigga's Crazy, which some record stores refused to put on display, became massive underground hits. And now, 40 years later, I, a white person, still feel a bit awkward saying the title. Chuck D remembers hearing them as a teenager.
Richard Pryor was almost like a guideline to understand who you were. Don't get it twisted. Don't be fooled. You black coming up in America, so they'll tell you one thing, but understand that there's another way that you're gonna have to find for yourself. And here's a good guideline.
But here's what I want you all to do for me.
Don't believe the hype. You wonder why a nigga don't go completely mad. You know you do. You get your shit together. You work all week, right? And then you get dressed. You make it. Maybe say cat make $125. We get $80 if he lucky. Right, and he go out, get clean, be driving with his old lady, going out to a club, and police pull over. Get out of the car, that was a robbery, a nigga look just like you. All right, put your hands up, take your pants down, spread your cheeks. Now, what nigga feel like having fun after that?
No, let's just go home, baby.
Don't believe the hype.
Richard Pryor's racially conscious work started to get him really noticed in a divided America, with his epithets and phrases becoming a staple of black youth culture throughout the late 60s and 70s.
I went to jail for income tax evasion, right? They give niggas time like it's lunch down there. You go down there looking for justice, that's what you find, just us.
Writing partner Paul Mooney.
He was very important in it, just like James Brown was too. You know, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. You know, Richard made those expressions, just us. You know, I'm reaching for my license.
Cops put a hurting on your ass, man, you know. See, white folks get a ticket, they pull over. Hey, officer, yes, glad to be of help. Here you go. Nigga got to be talking about, I am reaching into my pocket for my license.
Richard's popularity wasn't confined to the black underground. As his work became edgier, his popularity grew in the mainstream, with album sales and films of his stand-up work like Live and Smoking becoming big sellers. Here's Lenny Henry.
People thought they owned Richard Pryor's act. Black people and white people. It's like, I remember going to a Status Quo concert once, and I was the only black person in the room. It was like being at a Klan rally, and it was like a badge of courage that I've been there going again. And going to see a Richard Pryor concert, if you're a white person, I felt was like the white people were brave to come out into the ghetto to watch the show.
Richard Pryor, very much the status quo of black comedy. Former manager Ron de Blasio.
I remember one time I went out and it was in Detroit, and I asked this guy, why are you here? And he said, well, all my black friends talk about it. And they tell me this guy's great, and I want to see what it's about, and he's absolutely terrific. He never altered what it was he was saying for one audience or the other audience. He got his popularity by starting off in the African-American world. But by the time he crossed over, everybody else was ready for him.
Professor Jamal Joseph is an ex-Black Panther and a film professor who has studied Richard's work.
His jokes allowed us to have a conversation about race and about taboo subjects that we weren't having before. Allowed black people to talk about some things a little bit more freely, and white people who are also coming to these concerts and the shows, allowing them to talk about it. And that was an important conversation to have.
Richard employed his comedy as a kind of therapy, using his confessional style to purge the pain of his abusive youth. But while he was thriving on stage, he was still struggling to come to terms with his inner demons. Former manager Ron de Blasio remembers.
You know, it's funny, Richie's personality off stage was entirely different than it was on stage. Off stage, he was withdrawn. He was a lonely kid, a very, very lonely kid. He endured pain.
Comedian Dick Gregory.
I didn't know then that something in his soul. I didn't know his mama was a whore, his grandmother man. But all of that he brought with him. You know, you couldn't look him in the face because his head is down. And that's how timid he was and bashful. But when that light came on.
Pryor himself was painfully self-conscious of the struggle created by his dual persona.
But sometimes I feel like there's a person, Richard Pryor, and he does all this comedy and stuff. He does all this stuff. And then there's me. And I wonder what I have to do with Richard. You know, I live in his house. I feel like I live in his house, and I drive his car, and I spend his money. You know, but it ain't me. It's not me. It's the work.
Writer Mel Watkins.
Very few people can stand reality. We try to pretend that we're civilized in a way that, if you really honestly look at yourself, you perhaps are not. Comics like Richard, who pushed it to that edge and really tried to delve into that, were getting into a psychological area that can be dangerous. If you throw away all those restraints and you have to deal with yourself in that manner, you don't have the safety zones that most of us have. If you start really looking at things coldly and seeing the way they are, it's a drastic perception.
Richard Pryor.
I used to think that might be insane or something. You know, the stains in your mind, you wonder where you get the thoughts from. You would dare tell no one you thought that, you know, you go, wow. But I like to experiment with them. I like to go with them and drive people crazy.
Ever feel kind of down and out, you don't know just what to do? Living all of your days in darkness, let the sun shine through.
Pryor's success brought popularity and an increasingly rock and roll lifestyle with women, drugs and celebrity fans in abundance. But close family and friends worried that he was struggling to assuage his own pain with narcotics and empty friendships. Former manager Ron de Blasio.
People around him were having a good time, and it was great. He loved the idea that they could have a good time. Many times he couldn't jump into that circle. There was something that held him back.
Richard's daughter, Rain Pryor.
His house was always full of people. You never know who they were. There would be celebrities there, but it wasn't like they were there every weekend and these were his friends and they hung out.
Paul Mooney.
They would all come see Richard. Peter O'Toole, Mick Jagger. He was crazy about Richard too. Jack Nicholson, Charleston Heston, could you believe that? And also Orson Welles loved Richard Pryor. They all would come to see Richard.
But were any of these A-listers actually his friends? Pryor's son, Richard Jr.
Ooh, that's a tough question. Because if you look back now, when you have money and you have all the drugs, you're pretty much buying people.
But Pryor was desperate for the close friendships that his childhood had lacked.
That's a special thing when someone is your friend. And if you're a friend with someone you can just be yourself with, that means a lot to people, to be themselves.
Paul Mooney.
He needed to be loved, I think. And something was missing. I mean, that's why I think he stayed loaded a lot. There was something going inside that was really hurting, that you'd have to be inside to know.
Richard's drug use escalated hugely throughout the 70s. He had a seemingly inexhaustible appetite for cocaine and eventually freebase. Richard Jr. remembers him at his lowest.
I believe I was probably about 16 or 17. He asked me one time to get high with him. You know, I think when it comes to a point when your dad asks you to smoke some crack with him or something, you know, some coke with him, you know something's up.
Freebasing, I freebased about 8 months straight. My bitch left me, I went crazy. But I fell in love with this pipe. This pipe controlled my very being. We say, don't answer the phone. We have smoking to do.
Paul Mooney.
He would tell everybody, Paul doesn't do drugs. All the ballers, the big shots, said, you're going to give some drugs to Paul, give them to me. More for me, more for me. And I mean, the ballers then, I mean, they were like insane. They would take a $1,000 bill and put cocaine in it and pass it around the limo and sniff. And when it got to me, I just wiped the drugs off the money and put it in my pocket. I mean, I became very wealthy. I loved it. I got very wealthy.
My grandmother, she pulled that shit on me. She said, what's that you doing, boy? I said, cocaine, Mama. She said, whoa, Jesus, help me, go kill me, God, go kill me, go kill me, God, go kill me. I said, Mama, don't do that shit. Look, I'm slowing it up. Look, Mama, I'm putting it down the toilet. $1,600 worth of shit. She found out how much it cost. She got mad. You could have sold some of that shit back to the man you got it from. Told you that shit make you ignorant.
Richard's drug use continued even after a near brush with death. He suffered a heart attack in 1977 whilst visiting his gran for her 78th birthday, but almost immediately went back to cocaine.
Richard, you
Politics coincided with his increasingly brutal honesty as a stand-up. This was partly a result of his use of drugs to help mentally step outside society's norms, but it was also a result of his routines raking up painful events from his past, a pain he self-medicated with booze and coke. Looking back during a brief drug-free period, Pryor was typically candid about his struggle to deal with addiction.
You know, aside from the drugs, I still have them same feelings. It's just that I don't have the drugs to deal with and the alcohol. It's very hard if you spend a lifetime covering up feelings to suddenly have them come at you. If you're honest, then you can deal. When you don't be honest, then eventually you get back into doing things. Excuse me.
You're listening to BBC Radio 2 with me, Russell Brand, on Richard Pryor, Was It Something I Said? There is some filthy language in this and some quite volatile and damaging ideas. So if you're a vulnerable man or woman, get out of your house now and imagine that life isn't happening. As well as affecting his health, Richard Pryor's drug use was making him increasingly paranoid and putting a huge strain on his work and personal relationships. His loss of self-control and freakouts became legendary, but perhaps the most extreme was the infamous car shooting incident when Pryor got his Magnum out and demolished the car his third wife Deborah was trying to leave him in. Richard being Richard, even this painful event, which culminated in his arrest, was documented in his stand-up.
All I did was kill a car. You thought I'd murdered somebody. I thought it was fair myself, you know. My wife was gonna leave me. I said, not in this motherfucker, you ain't. You may be leaving, but you're gonna be walking away from this motherfucker. But I'm killing this here. So go get them hush puppies and hit your ass on down the road. I had a Magnum too, man. I shot one of them tires, boom. Tire said, oh. Got good to me. I shot another one, boom. And that vodka I was drinking said, go ahead, shoot something else. I shot the motor fell out the motherfucker. The motor said, fuck it. And then the police came. I went into the house. Because they got Magnums too. And they don't kill cars. They kill niggas.
That incident was symptomatic of Pryor's toxic relationships with women. He wed 5 times and remarried twice for a total of 7 marriages. A ferocious womanizer throughout his life, he seemed unable to keep himself from straying with girlfriends and prostitutes despite his competing instinct to settle down. Here's writer Mel Watkins.
He did go to a Catholic school. He was very impressed with it. His grandmother was very impressed with Catholicism. In Catholicism, people marry, and Richard seemed to do that. Instead of being like many other performers who had mistresses all over the place, he may have had that, but he chose most often to marry them and try to make something work with them, even if it didn't last very long. Now, some of those marriages were based on very flimsy foundations.
You meet people and you fall in love and shit. That's really amazing. That you meet somebody completely different, you don't know a fucking thing about, and they were born on the earth, and then all of a sudden you guys meet, and you start talking, and you love each other, and you go away together. Sometimes you stay together. Me, no. I had to move on. Because marriage takes a certain kind of commitment that you got to make. Like, you can't fuck other women if you're going to be married. The wives don't go for that. I don't know. It doesn't seem fair to me.
Richard's relationship with his second wife, Shelley, seemed to typify the cycle of infatuation, disappointment and pain that characterised many of his marriages. Here's daughter Rain Pryor.
When they first got together, it was, typical, I think, flower child relationship. We're going to change the world, and everything's going to be great. And my dad got famous, and my mom describes it, came back with a mustache, a gold chain, and a silk shirt, and she knew it was over. She knew now it's going downhill. She saw cocaine for the first time and thought it was baby powder and threw it in the toilet. And, when they got in a fight and my dad punched her out, and she knew it was over.
When I was married, man, I tried to be whatever it is. I can't do it.
Beat women up. I think that had to do with where he came from. It's what he saw, it's what he knew, it's what was comfortable.
It seemed Pryor had yet to come to terms with his painful childhood. His relationships and attitude to women were increasingly displaying the effects of his being brought up in a working brothel where his own mother was a prostitute. Seems to have made an impact on the young man. Here's Mel Watkins.
I've seen Richard out. I went out with him once at a few single bars in L.A. He was at the top of his fame at this point. And yet, he approached a very beautiful woman at the bar and put $200 on the bar and said, "I'm Richard Pryor. Would you like to go out to the car with me?" This is just an indication of something that I think is derived from his experience from being around the prostitutes.
Oh, you just keep on using me until you use me up.
Richard used his family home to recreate the familiar role women had played in his youth, with prostitutes and girlfriends around constantly. This somewhat pluralistic domestic situation had intense repercussions on his children as well as his wives. Richard Jr. remembers.
My dad hooked me up with a girl, or a lady, who was, I think she was probably like 25 years old at the time. I was like 12. And she called me to her room. She said, "Can you put some lotion on my back?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "Your dad usually does this." And then she was like, "Your father wants me to show you some things." And then she proceeded to engage me. And actually to have someone actually do it shows the impact you could have on people. That you could tell a 25-year-old lady to sleep with my 12-year-old son. And she would actually do it. If you think about it, it's kind of sick. But exciting at the same time.
Rain Pryor.
He was always surrounded by, the pimps and the madams and the prostitutes. And there was a time sitting at his house and, I was like, "Dad, the hooker needs to be paid." It was just like normal conversation, and everyone's like, "That's the funniest thing in the world." And I was like, "But she does," because to me, it was just, that's the way it was. It's like, you go to school and the teacher goes, "What did you do this weekend?" I'm like, "I hung out with Henrietta the hooker and it was cool."
Richard didn't let his failures in family life deter him from his career. His 1977 comedy series, The Richard Pryor Show, was a breakthrough in black comedy. Bill Cosby.
It's a spectacular piece, and racially it was saying some very, very wonderful things. And this put Richard way ahead of the likes of a Dick Gregory, certainly ahead of me in terms of blatant calling out of racism.
You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
However, the revolution was not televised for very long. The Richard Pryor Show was cut in 1977 after only 4 episodes, following conflicts between Richard and the network about its controversial content. He continued to write for comedies such as Stanford and Son, Lily Tomlin and Saturday Night Live, as well as co-writing Blazing Saddles with Mel Brooks. But in terms of raw monetary success, it was his on-screen role in the movie world that really broke Richard Pryor. Parts in films like Grease Lightning and Superman 3 saw him become the highest paid black actor in the world, but Hollywood came with its own costs. Lenny Henry.
He was the funniest person in the world. There was one point where he got signed to do some $30 million deal with Universal or something, and that was I think that was his undoing, really, because I think they were lazy. Oh yeah, well, we won't even bother writing the script. Richard will come in and just be hilarious.
Like now, if people come up to me all the time and they be offering me shit to do, and it's exciting and I feel great about it, but I'll be having a conversation with somebody I ain't seen in years, like an old friend from Peoria, and we be talking and be great, and they, "By the way, I got this script." I say, "What? Do you work in the foundry?" But it's about steel workers, bro. Look, check this out. Read this part. The man walks in the plant, blank, blank, blank. That's the kind of shit you can fill that in.
Film professor Jamal Joseph.
He made his name being really true to himself and the kind of comedy that he wanted to make. And then Hollywood came calling with big fat checkbooks, but you can't do that same kind of stuff in the mainstream movies. So part of his torture had to be going back to being safe and going back to being clean. Sure, he was, making lots of money and he was, reaching a worldwide audience, but how was he feeling when he had to do, movies like Stir Crazy and Blue Streak?
I went to prison to do a film with Gene Wilder. It was called Stir Crazy, right? And everybody, wait a minute. No, I really appreciate it. Gene appreciated that y'all went to see it and shit. I don't get it. No, I mean, I watched them. I said, "Oh, shit. My shit is over." I bought some land immediately.
In 1979, amidst the turmoil of his film career, Richard Pryor's grandmother died. She was Richard's rock of stability, having raised him as a child, and he fell into a long depression. Desperate for a new anchor in his chaotic life, he took the advice of his therapist and visited Africa to reconnect with his roots.
Have any of you ever been to Africa, back to the motherland? That's something. No, it's just a nice feeling. I know how white people feel in America now. Relaxed. Because when I heard the police car, I knew they wasn't coming after me.
The trip had a major effect on Pryor and made him reconsider the very fundamentals of his stand-up work, particularly his language. Daughter Rain Pryor.
He goes to Africa and he sees people that all look like him. He looks at the money and it's pictures of him. Do you know what I mean? Black people. And he realized there are no niggers in Africa. So he came home and was like, that's it for the word. And it changed him.
A lot of people didn't like it when Richard Pryor gave up the N-word, a bit like when Dylan went electric. Oh, go on, do an N-word, do an N-word. The argument went worldwide, even affecting a distant corner of Birmingham. Lenny Henry.
I clapped in the car and nearly drove into a lamppost when I heard the Africa routine. He realises that he's been using that word over and over and over and over again, and it's a hateful word and it's a slave word. I was on air. I was floating on air for about 3 hours afterwards because it was like he'd had a major league epiphany, and it's a joy. It's a joy.
One thing that happened to me that was magic was I was leaving. I was sitting in the hotel lobby, right? And a voice said, what do you see? Look around. And I looked around, and I saw people all colors and shapes. And the voice said, do you see any niggas? I said, no. He said, you know why? Because there aren't any. Because I'd been there 3 weeks. I hadn't said it. And it started making me cry, man. I said, holy shit. All the acts I've been doing, and as an artist, a comedian, and speaking and trying to say something, and I've been saying that, and that's a devastating fucking word. That has nothing to do with us.
But Pryor's depression continued, and his use of freebase escalated. June the 9th, 1980 saw one of the most extraordinary events in Richard's life. After a particularly long freebasing session alone in his room, he doused himself in alcohol and set himself alight. Although the incident was reported as a freebasing accident, friends and family understood it was a deliberate act.
There's something wrong with this picture. Tell me what it is, why don't you?
Writing partner Paul Mooney.
When he burned up, that was kind of like a suicide thing. Semi-suicide, let's say. Because he really got crazy with that freebasing. He was lucky he didn't kill himself, that he didn't burn up. He was real lucky.
Inevitably, this incredibly physically and emotionally painful incident became fuel for Pryor's comedy. Lenny Henry.
That is a routine and a half about burning himself up. It's just the most harrowing and yet beautiful description of a man's pain you will ever hear. It's just wonderful.
Catching on fire is inspiring. They should use it for the Olympics. Because I did the 100-yard dash in about 4.6 in the underbrush. And you know something I noticed? When you run down the street on fire, people will move out of your way. Except for one old drunk, right? He was like, hey, buddy, can we get a light? Come on, pal, just slow up, okay? Just a little off the sleeve, what is it? And I got to the hospital. You can really tell when you fucked up when the doctor goes, ah! Holy shit. Why don't we just get some coleslaw and serve this up? What is that?
This incredible incident had a huge impact on Pryor's family and circle of friends. Paul Mooney.
I went over to the hospital. He was all burned up, and he knew it. And when I came in the room, and he went, Dr. Frankenstein, help me, heal me, Dr. Frankenstein, help me. And I started laughing. But I had to fake it. It was terrifying.
Pryor made a full recovery from his burns, and the 80s became one of the most commercially successful periods of his life. His stand-up work was more thoughtful and structured, and he released seminal records and films of his performances like Live on Sunset Strip and Here and Now. He continued to be a hit in Hollywood with films like Superman 3 and Brewster's Millions, proving he could still make it in the mainstream. Ironically, however, it was while working on a film set that Pryor discovered he had a condition that would affect the rest of his life and career. Finding himself physically unable to make his body move as the directors were asking him to, Pryor finally checked himself in for tests. He had multiple sclerosis. Daughter Rain Pryor.
He was diagnosed in 1987, went through a whole bunch of tests and the MRIs and realized he had this thing called MS, which he didn't know what it was, and we slowly had to discover it.
1989's See No Evil, Hear No Evil and Harlem Nights were a tragic contrast to his dynamic past. Incredibly, Pryor continued doing stand-up even when his MS developed to an extent that he had difficulty speaking and had to perform in a wheelchair. But Pryor used his disability to his advantage in his routines, documenting it with brutal honesty and pushing the envelope of confessional comedy further than he had ever gone. Working on Richard Pryor's last stand-up tour in 1992.
I used to put on earphones and I'd talk to him and give him his lines and I would coach him and help him. And we were at the Apollo and I had to get in the booth and talk to him. And I started crying. I was in the booth. They said, "What are you crying for?" I said, "This is the last time I'll ever do this." I knew it was over. Because weeks later he lost his speech, I just knew it. I knew I would never do that again.
December 10th, 2005.
The American comedian and actor Richard Pryor has died at the age of 65. He suffered a heart attack at his home in Los Angeles after having been ill for many years with multiple sclerosis. From Los Angeles, David Willis reports.
Richard Pryor was born in a brothel and by the age of 7 was playing drums in a nightclub. He later became a groundbreaking stand-up comedian who was eventually...
Mel Watkins.
Every comic that I've ever talked to has said that they've been influenced by Richard Pryor. He mimed a certain area of life that other people had not really touched upon. Satire became more gritty after him.
Paul Mooney.
Eddie Murphy, Martin Lawrence, all of them, bar none. Chris Tucker, Chris Skull, all of them, bar none. Bar none. Richard's the tree. They're all apples from the tree. Richard was the mothership.
Lenny Henry.
It's like a gold standard of art. He didn't kind of go, "Oh, well, I'm not going to talk about that because they won't like that," like we do. I mean, in this country, Tommy Cooper had lots of problems, but we never heard about him. So did Eric Morecambe. So do I. But we'd never talk about it on stage because that's not what we do. Whereas what Richard Pryor did was say, "My life is yours."
Richard Pryor's contribution to stand-up comedy is almost impossible to evaluate, as he could be accredited with its creation in its current form. For all the agony he caused and endured, he never lost his alchemical ability to use truth to turn pain into laughter.
Trying to make it real, but compared to what?
What makes me laugh? Just life, situations in life that make you laugh or you cry, Can take either direction. It's a great gift to be able to laugh sometimes. It really comes in handy.
Trying to make it real, but compared to what?
Richard Pryor, Was It Something I Said was presented by me, Russell Brand, and was produced by Sam Bryant. It was a Something Else production for Radio 2.